So I'd like to demonstrate the Scratch sort of construction of a very small program. And hopefully this program urges you to sort of see in a manner which can get you from working with nothing to at least get you to working with something. It's better to work with something and not know the answer or how to continue than to work with nothing and not know the answer and how to continue. And so if you have something at least, then hopefully it can be more intuitive to work forward and look for solutions from there. And so essentially here we have a Scratch template, which we also call the main method. It's sort of our canvas here. And what we want to do is, this is our task. I'm going to sort of highlight our task here. Our task is to build a program which reads in the grades and names of, let's say, X students, or 4 students for the purpose of this example, 4 students. After that, what it's going to do is it is going to present the name and grade of the highest student. We must also ensure that we are within the range of 0 to 100, and so we can't pass that particular range. So this seems like a pretty easy program to build here. What I like to do first before I begin is I like to first understand what variables would I need. Well, recall that I wanted to have a grade, right? It has to read in a grade. So I'd obviously have a grade, right? And that could be a double or an integer. I'm going to put in a double because it accounts for both. And so we're going to have a grade, and we are also going to have a string which sort of reads in the name, because we really want to present the name and the grade of the highest student, of the highest graded student rather. And so this essentially, let me copy this and sort of keep this at the head here, just so we can refer back to it when we're getting confused. So we have 2 things, right? We have a name and we have a grade. Now, so we know how many times we want to, we know how many students there are. There are 4. And we want to ask for the name and the grade 4 times, right, for each student. That's how we would update the value for each student, or for each student's grade and name. And so if we know how many times we want to ask something or do something, we use something called a for loop. Now, a for loop is divided into 4 very concise and simple segments. The first segment is the counter, where we set I to 0, and I can be anything. We also then, what we do is we say, well, how many times do you want to execute the particular block of code which will follow the for loop? Well, we want to execute it 4 times because there are 4 students. And for each time, we are going to increment the value of I by 1. Now, instead of doing I, we could have also done students, just to make this a little more intuitive. So now that we're inside the body of the for loop here, which can be found by clicking any one of the 2 braces, what we want to do now is, well, what did I want to do 4 times? Well, what I wanted to do 4 times was I wanted to ask for their name and I wanted to ask for their grade. So why don't I just go ahead and do that? So first and foremost, I'm going to ask for, what is your name? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for, what is your grade? By now, I have 2 print statements which will just print what is your name and what is your grade 4 times. None of this is actually taking input from the keyboard. And so in order to make it possible, I have to actually make something called a scanner object. If you don't know what an object is yet, that's perfectly fine, because you can just follow this syntax and still benefit from having the scanner. The scanner will actually give me an error if I don't have the class. And so the class essentially allows me, the import statement rather, just allows me to import from the scanner class and make an instantiation of the scanner object. Now that I have the scanner ready, I can sort of initialize these variables to their particular, to the scanner. I can say that name will equal the name of the scanner dot next, which will essentially just take in 1 word. There's a little face right there coming up in our program. And here, after we ask for their name, what we can do now is we can ask for the grade. Initialize grade as a variable which is tied to the scanner. Now what we can do, so at this point we've asked for their name and we've asked for their grade, but recall that we had a range. It can't pass from 0 to 100. And so how would it be intuitive where to put this or how to put this? Well, we said that we can't have the grade exceed 100 or be lower than 0. So it would be pretty intuitive to put that around the place where we're asking for their grade. And so we're asking for their grade here. So I could say, well, I could say that, look, if the grade that they enter is greater than 100, then that meets my requirement in the sense that it's lower than, it's greater than 100, which is actually not something that I want to happen. Or if the grade is less than 0, in other words, if it's not, again, if it's not within that range, then I want to sort of give them a warning message here. I want to say not within range, okay? I'm just going to say that it's not within range. And instead of having out here, I'm actually going to put ERR, and that's going to give me a little red highlight when I execute my program, and that's going to give me a better warning, a more impactful warning. And so if the grade is greater than 100 or the grade is less than 0, it's going to give them this warning message. Otherwise, and that's actually what else means, it means otherwise. Otherwise, what am I going to do if it is within range? Well, think about it. What did we want to do? Well, we wanted to get the highest graded student. This is where it can get tricky. Think about it this way. The highest graded student for the first iteration, the highest graded student is the first grade entered. What do I mean by that? I mean, what am I talking about? Well, essentially what I'm saying here is that the highest graded student for the first iteration is the first grade entered. For this particular block of code, if I'm judging what the highest score is for 4 students, well, for the first time, the first grade entered is going to be the highest because there are no other grades to compare it to. And so essentially what I would be doing is I would say, well, look, the highest grade is going to be equal to the grade, whatever grade was entered first. That's going to be the highest grade. And let's say the highest name or the name of the person who scored the highest is essentially going to be equal to whatever name I entered in the first iteration. And so right now we're on the first iteration. The highest grade is the grade which was entered first. And the highest name is equal to the name which is entered first. That's because there's nothing else to compare it to. And so this is absolutely fine for the first iteration, but it can become problematic when we step away here and we start considering other details. I'll show you what those details are. So essentially, I mean, this is completely fine, but when we, so over here I have a little snippet which can just show you what's happening. There are really 2 things that we're dealing with now. We're dealing with the highest grade and we're dealing with the highest name. So the highest grade, again, remember for the first iteration, is going to be whatever the grade was entered here, okay? And that's for the first iteration. So when we go through iteration number 1, essentially what happens is it goes down and it says, well, okay, highest grade is equal to the grade which was entered. The second time it goes down, and this is really where it gets tricky, the second time it goes down, it says, what is your grade? Okay, and then we have 2 things. We not only do we have a highest grade, but now we also have a grade. Okay, we also have a grade. And then if we go down more, it says it sets highest grade equal to grade. And then it comes up back again. So essentially what we're doing is, and sort of redundantly, what we're doing is we're setting whatever grade we enter is going to be the highest grade. That's not what we want to do. Instead, what we want to do is we want to have something called the highest grade, which we do. And then the second time around, when we come back down, we want to ask the user what their grade is, and we want to compare that grade with what the highest grade was. And if that grade is greater than the highest grade, then my friends, we have a new highest grade. This would now be our highest grade. And so we want to implement this idea through a Boolean condition, and I'm going to show you how. So what we're going to do is this entire block of code is perfectly valid, but we're going to do is we're going to say, well, if the grade is greater than the highest grade, then and only then does executing this block actually become worthwhile. And you can see that we actually have these red markers here, these red highlights, and that's because highest grade and highest name don't actually exist. Okay, and let's go back into the class level and actually bring them into existence here. Let's just say highest grade is equal to, well, it's not going to be a string, it's going to be a double, right? So highest grade is going to be equal to 0. Let me just set that as a default value. Java doesn't know that it's eventually going to be initialized to something, and so we can do the same thing with the name here, because we're also getting an error on the name. I'm going to leave it empty quotation marks for now. So now we have this condition, and each and every time it's going to update whatever the highest grade is, right? And if it's not, if the grade entered is not greater than the highest grade, well, then it's going to do whatever we ask that is outside the for loop. So this entire thing is the for loop here. You can see, zooming out, that I've underlined what the for loop is just by clicking on one of those braces. Outside the for loop, let me go ahead and declare, assuming that the for loop has done this 4 times, it now has who the highest grade is. And so the highest grade, or let me put the name first. Let me say the highest name, right? And that's the person who has the highest grade. The highest name is, or the highest name has a grade of, and then let me go ahead and put the highest score. Highest grade. Highest name has the highest grade. So the highest name has a grade of this, okay? And so, we could also make it a little more clear, which is the highest grade. Okay. And now if we go ahead and execute this program here, we should get what we want. So it says, what is your name? Now, this is going to ask me 4 times, but for purposes of demonstration, just to make this a little more concise, let me go ahead and just ask twice. So we're going to have 2 names here. One is going to be David. David is going to have a grade of 50. And let's see, Ashley is going to have a grade of 60. So Ashley is 10 ahead of David. Ashley has a grade of 60, which is the highest grade in the class. So that does what we want it to do. Now, another part of this program, which I actually have not mentioned yet, is actually, let's go ahead and see what happens if we enter an invalid number. Let's say we enter 2200, right? It's not within range, and so it asks what Ashley's grade is, right? And Ashley's grade is going to be 50. It's actually going to be in range, and Ashley has the highest grade because that was the only grade entered. Now, like I was saying before, I actually haven't mentioned another part of this program, which is to calculate the average. Calculate the average. Now, the average, essentially, I mean, I'm not going to go too much into it just because I want this program to be simplified here, but calculating the average, what we're going to do essentially is we're going to add the number of grades that we have, the total of the grades, and then we're going to divide that by how many students there are. So we're going to essentially take the number of grades, like if I had 2 grades which were 180, I would add those grades up and then divide them by how many students there are, which in this case there are 2. Normally they would be 4. And so the way I would do that, I mean, a key part of doing that would be adding the total number of grades. And so a way to do that here is, and this sort of reinforces the idea of what a for loop is. Before the for loop ends here, this is the for loop. Before the for loop ends, what we're going to do is we're going to understand that for the first grade entered, if I entered, let's say 64, let's say David, right? So David has 60. Now, the sum is going to be the grade, right? Because if you think about it, the complete number, the sum of all the grades that I have right now, I only have one, is just going to be the grade, whatever grade the person got. But the next time I come around, the sum is, since sum equals grade, the sum is actually going to be whatever grade was before, which is actually just sum, added to whatever grade is now. And so we could do sum plus grade. How does that sound? Now, of course, I'm getting errors again here just because sum doesn't exist. And so you can work with these variables that just don't exist, but once you understand their use, you can bring them into existence and kind of summon them into your program. I'm getting another error again because, again, the program doesn't know that sum will eventually be initialized. And so I can set it equal to 0. And that should take care of that problem. And it's not taking care of that problem because sum is equal to sum plus grade. And if grade doesn't equal anything yet, then sum can't equal anything yet. And so what we have to do is we actually have to follow this logical approach of setting these values before they're used in the program. Let's see here. So I've set sum and I've set grade. Cannot convert from double to int. And so essentially what I've done here is I've declared an integer, which is sum, and I've said that sum is actually the additions of the grades, right? And grade is actually just a double, and so it can't add doubles and then store them in an integer unless I cast it to an integer, but that's a little advanced here. What we're going to do instead is we're just going to change this to a double, and that should take care of our problem just as fine. Okay, now I'd like to show you another approach here. Another approach is that we have 4 students, okay, and we have four students which are stored in strings, and then we have the grades of all 4 students. You can ignore this part here. Then we have a for loop yet again, which goes until 4, obviously, because we have 4 students. So if we're on the first iteration, then we ask for the name and the grade. And then we say, well, if that particular student's grade, which is student 1's grade, is greater than 100 or less than 0, then we must be out of range. And then we set that student grade equal to 0. Otherwise, if we're on the first iteration, that is to say the second iteration, because 0 is also counted, the way it goes is 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so if we say I is less than 4, then essentially what we're saying is that we're only going to have these many executions, and these many executions are actually 4. And so that little trick there is used to simplify, symbolize what we'd like to do. And so coming back to the topic here, if we're on the second iteration here at 1, then we're going to ask for the second person's name, and we're going to do the same comparison. And we're going to keep doing this until we actually exit the for loop, and then we're going to essentially judge whether or not the first student's grade is greater than the second, the third, and the fourth. We do that for each and every one, but this time we're doing it for the second, this time we're doing it for the third, and this time we're doing it for the fourth. If one of these are selected, that means one of them had the highest grade. And if one of them had the highest grade, then we're going to print out that person's name, and we're going to print out their grade. So this is another way to do it, but what I'd like to show you here is you can actually use the for loop to simplify all this down. I mean, just compare the heart of our code is this. Okay, I mean, if you really want to look at the complete picture, this is our code here, and here I can't sort of zoom out without actually making this stuff unreadable. And so it really goes to show that if we use sort of these ideas to sort of condense and simplify our code, we can actually get really far. And so that's a very important thing when programming, is to write concise and clean code, which is understandable, maintainable, and hopefully not as long and messy. It sort of gives our program the chances of having more errors, right? The more complex something is, the more bigger something is in terms of structure, the more complex it gets. and we may overlook several problems. And so this is a little more concise and workable. Thank you so much.